She had traveled 3 days through blinding snow to marry a man she'd never met, and he looked her dead in the eye and said he had never written the letter. The whole town was watching. Someone laughed. A woman whispered loud enough to carry. Evelyn Mercer stood on that frozen platform with one trunk, no family, and nowhere left to go. And she did not cry. Not yet. Then a small hand grabbed the hem of her coat. She looked down. A 9-year-old girl with red-rimmed eyes and a trembling chin said, "I wrote it. I wrote all of it. Please don't go." If you've ever stayed somewhere you weren't wanted because someone needed you to, this story is for you. Watch until the end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The train left Evelyn Mercer standing alone before she was fully ready to be left. It happened that way sometimes. The world moving before you'd finished deciding how to meet it. One moment she was on the platform watching the last passenger car pull away, and the next she was simply there, in Harlan Creek, Wyoming, in the first week of February, with a single trunk beside her feet and the cold settling into her coat like it intended to stay. She had packed that trunk 3 times before getting it right. 2 good dresses, one better than the other. Her teaching certificates, folded and wrapped in oilcloth. A photograph of her parents taken the summer before the fever that took them both inside of 2 weeks. A small volume of poetry she'd owned since she was 12 and never once left behind. Everything else, her rented room in Milford, Ohio, her position at the grammar school, the quiet, reliable shape of her daily life, she had left behind without much ceremony. She wasn't a sentimental person, or at least she'd spent several years convincing herself she wasn't. The letter had arrived in October. She'd read it twice before setting it down, then picked it up and read it a 3rd time. "I am not a man who writes easily," it had begun, which she'd appreciated, because it was obvious. The handwriting was careful but uneven, the sentences direct in a way that felt like effort rather than nature. "I have 2 children, a daughter of 9 and a son of 5. I have a ranch that takes more from me than it gives back most years. I lost my wife 3 years ago. I am not looking for someone to replace her. I'm looking for someone willing to build something honest from what's left. I can offer you a real home and a real life, if you can accept that neither will ever be easy." It was not a romantic letter. It was barely even a warm one, but there was something in it that had struck her as more truthful than the careful courtship letters she'd received from 2 other men in the years since her parents died. Letters that promised comfort and security and said almost nothing real. Gideon Hale's letter had said, "This will be hard." She had found that more convincing than any promise. She'd written back. He'd written again. 4 months of correspondence, and somewhere inside those letters she had made up her mind. Now she stood on the platform at Harlan Creek and looked for him. He was not difficult to find. The station was small. A single building, a water tower, 3 men in heavy coats talking near a wagon. There was a man standing apart from the others, broad-shouldered and tall, with dark hair showing beneath the brim of his hat, watching the train pull away with an expression she could not immediately read. He looked the right age. He looked like a man who spent most of his life outdoors. She thought, "That's him," and felt the particular mixture of nervousness and resolve that had carried her this far. She picked up her trunk and walked toward him. "Mr. Hale?" He turned. His face was weathered but not unkind. Strong jaw, dark eyes, the kind of lines around the mouth that came from squinting in sun and wind rather than from smiling. He looked at her for a moment in a way that confused her, something shifting behind his expression that she couldn't name. "I'm Evelyn Mercer," she said, "from Ohio. We've been corresponding since October." He looked at her trunk. He looked at her face. Something closed in his expression. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. She heard the words. They didn't make sense. "I'm sorry? I didn't write you any letter." The cold went through her coat then, not like weather, like something else entirely. "Mr. Hale, I don't know you," he said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, which somehow made it worse. He just sounded like a man telling the truth about something he didn't understand. "I don't know who told you to come here, or what letter you've got, but I didn't write it." She was aware then that the 3 men near the wagon had gone quiet, that the station master had come to his doorway, that 2 women standing farther down the platform were watching with the particular attention of people who expected something worth talking about later. "I have your letters," she said. Her voice stayed level. She was proud of it afterward for staying level. 4 of them. They have your name on them. Then someone used my name, Gideon Hale said. It wasn't me. One of the men near the wagon said something she didn't catch. The other one laughed. Not loud, but not quiet enough. The station master shook his head with the faint, disgusted pity of a man watching someone else's embarrassment. She had traveled 3 days. She had left everything. She was standing in a town where she knew no one, with a trunk on a frozen platform, and a man looking at her with those flat, honest eyes telling her that the entire reason she had come didn't exist. She did not cry. Her eyes burned, but she did not cry. She had learned, after her parents, after the slow, grinding years of teaching other people's children and sleeping in a rented room that was always too quiet, that crying in front of strangers was the one thing she could not afford. It cost too much. It gave too much away. I see, she said. She did not see. She had no idea what had happened, but she had to say something. She was calculating. The next train, whether there was one today or tomorrow, whether the station had somewhere she could sit, what she had in her purse, how far it would get her, when she felt it. A small hand, fingers closing around the hem of her coat from below, tugging once, tentative. She looked down. The girl was maybe 9 years old. Brown hair in 2 untidy braids, one of them coming undone. A coat that was too thin for the weather and boots that had seen several winters. She had gray eyes, the same gray as Gideon Hale's, Evelyn noticed. And they were wet with tears she was visibly struggling not to shed. She was also shaking. Not just from cold. Miss? The girl said. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Then she stopped, swallowed, tried again. It was me. She glanced sideways at Gideon Hale with an expression Evelyn recognized instantly. The specific terror of a child who has done something they cannot take back and is now watching the moment arrive. I wrote the letters, all 4 of them. I found Papa's old letters from before, the ones he sent to Mama when they were courting, and I learned how he wrote, and then She stopped again. The whole platform had gone very still. Gideon Hale was staring at his daughter with an expression Evelyn could not read at all. Hazel, he said. Just the name, nothing else, in a voice that was almost no voice. I'm sorry, Papa. The tears came then, in earnest. I didn't mean to. I thought if someone came, if there was someone who could, I didn't know what else to do. She was talking fast now, the way children talk when they're confessing, and afraid if they slow down they'll lose their nerve. Noah keeps asking for Mama, and I don't know what to tell him anymore, and you don't talk, and Mrs. Finch said we needed a woman in the house, or else the county would. She broke off. I just wanted someone to come. I thought if someone came and she was nice, then maybe Hazel. His voice had changed now. Still no cruelty in it, but something else. Something that sounded like a man being handed a thing he didn't know how to hold. The girl pressed her lips together and looked at Evelyn, directly, with those gray eyes, and said, I'm sorry I tricked you. I know it was wrong, but please don't go. Evelyn looked at this child standing in the cold in her too thin coat, shaking, having just confessed something in front of half the town because she couldn't hold it anymore, having forged 4 months of correspondence because she was 9 years old and frightened, and she'd done the only thing she could think of. Something happened in Evelyn's chest that she didn't have a word for yet. She looked up. Gideon Hale was watching her with that closed expression. He said nothing. He looked like a man who had just been handed a situation with no good exit and knew it. Mr. Hale, she said carefully, is there somewhere out of this cold where we could speak? The station had a waiting room with a stove that wasn't putting out much heat. The station master made himself busy at his desk in a way that made it clear he was listening to every word. Hazel sat on a bench against the wall with her hands in her lap. She'd stopped crying, but her eyes were still red, and she kept looking at her father with the careful watchfulness of a child who has learned to read the weather in a grown man's silence. Noah wasn't there. Gideon had mentioned briefly that the boy was with a neighbor. He'd only brought Hazel to town for provisions. It took Evelyn a moment to understand that Gideon hadn't known, until this moment at the platform, that this day would be anything other than ordinary. I need you to understand, Gideon said, sitting across from her, hat in his hands, that I did not arrange this. I understand that. She had no right to use my name, to bring someone all this way. He didn't look at Hazel when he said it, which meant, Evelyn thought, that he was being careful, that he was angry and keeping it contained. I'll pay for your return ticket, whatever you need. That's generous, Evelyn said. She looked at Hazel, who was very carefully not looking at either of them, staring at a knot in the floorboards like it was the most important thing in the room. Can I ask you something? She said to the girl. Hazel looked up, cautious. The letters. You said you modeled them on your father's old correspondence with your mother? A small nod. Where did you learn to write like that? I'm a schoolteacher. I know handwriting. Those letters were careful. They sounded like a man, not a child. Something flickered across Hazel's face. Not quite pride, but something adjacent to it. I practiced. I copied his words first, then I tried to make them sound like him, but different. I rewrote the first one 6 times before I sent it. Evelyn let that settle. 6 drafts. From a 9-year-old alone, trying to solve a problem that no child should have to solve. She said to Gideon, "You have a remarkable daughter." He looked at Hazel then, finally. His jaw worked. He said nothing. I'm not asking you to honor the arrangement, Evelyn said. I'm not asking for anything I'm owed, because nothing is owed. But I'd like to make a proposal that's separate from the letters. Gideon looked at her. I'm a schoolteacher with no family and no position waiting for me in Ohio. You have 2 children and, from what I understand, a ranch that's short-handed. She kept her voice practical, businesslike, not because she felt businesslike, but because she'd learned that men who had closed themselves off responded better to propositions than to feelings. I'm not suggesting marriage. I'm suggesting an arrangement. I'd help with the children and the household, and you'd compensate me as you would any hired worker. Separate quarters. No obligations beyond what's agreed. If it doesn't work, I leave. Simple as that. The station master had entirely stopped pretending to work. Gideon noticed and looked at him, and the man suddenly found something urgent in his ledger. Why? Gideon said. Not hostile, genuinely asking. She looked at Hazel. The girl was watching her now, with an expression that was very much like the expression of someone who has been waiting a very long time for something and is afraid to believe it might arrive. Because she wrote 6 drafts, Evelyn said, and that deserves at least a conversation. The boarding house in Harlan Creek was run by a woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who was somewhere between 50 and 70 and had the kind of face that had stopped apologizing for itself decades ago. She gave Evelyn a room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked out over the main street, a quilt that smelled like cedar, and a supper of beans and salt pork that was plain but sufficient. You're the one from the platform, Mrs. Pruitt said when she brought the supper up. I suppose I am. Whole town's talking. I imagine so. Mrs. Pruitt set the tray down and looked at her with a directness that Evelyn found she didn't mind. What are you going to do? I'm not entirely sure yet. Gideon Hale is a hard man, Mrs. Pruitt said, not as a warning exactly, as a statement of fact. Wasn't always. Lost something when Clara died. A lot of men do. Doesn't always come back. The children are still there, Evelyn said. Yes. Mrs. Pruitt looked at her for a moment. Yes, they are. She left without further editorial comment, which Evelyn appreciated. She ate the beans, looked out the window at the dark street, and thought about the girl's face. Please don't go. Not please help my father, not please be my mother, just please don't go. The raw, simplest version of it. She had not made her decision yet, not fully. She was being honest with herself about that. She had proposed the arrangement because proposing it had been the only way to buy herself time to think, to slow the situation down before the next train arrived and swept her back east, and that was the end of it. But she kept coming back to the girl in the too thin coat. 6 drafts. She had been 23 when her mother died, and 24 when her father followed. She had been grown, with a teaching position, with the capacity to grieve and still function. She tried to imagine being 9. Tried to imagine being 9 with a little brother asking questions she couldn't answer, and a father who had gone somewhere inside himself, and a house that was slowly coming apart at the edges. Tried to imagine deciding, at 9, that the solution was to write letters. She couldn't decide if it was foolish or the bravest thing she'd ever heard of. The wind hit the window. Outside, Harlan Creek was the particular silent of a frontier town at night. Not peaceful exactly, more like a held breath. The mountains were out there somewhere beyond the dark, invisible but present, the way large things often were. She thought about her room in Ohio, the way it looked at the end of a school day, the gray winter light, and the quiet that had no one in it. She thought about the girl's gray eyes. In the morning, she sent a note to the Hale Ranch. Mr. Hale, I'd like to discuss the arrangement further, if you're willing. I'll be at the boarding house through Friday. E. Mercer. He came on Thursday. She heard the wagon before she saw it and looked out the window to see Gideon Hale tying his horse at the post below. Alone. He stood in the street for a moment before coming in, like a man steeling himself for something. Mrs. Pruitt put them in the parlor and brought coffee she hadn't been asked for, then stationed herself in the hallway in a way that would have been insulting if it hadn't also been appropriate. Gideon sat like a man who had not sat still in a long time. He held his coffee cup and looked at it. I talked to Hazel, he said. How is she? Quiet. A pause. She does that when she thinks she's in trouble. Goes quiet and waits. Something passed across his face. She's been doing it for 3 years, more or less. Evelyn waited. She told me more this time. At home, where she wasn't, where it was only her and me. He set down the coffee cup. She's been handling more of the house than I knew, cooking for Noah most mornings, making sure he gets to school. I thought Mrs. Beale from the next property was helping more than... I didn't ask closely enough. You've been managing a lot, Evelyn said. That's not an excuse. I didn't mean it as one. He looked at her then, really looked for the first time, like a man deciding whether to trust the thing in front of him. Why are you still here? It was a direct question and deserved a direct answer. Because when I was 24, my parents died and there was no one who stayed, she said. And I've spent a long time knowing exactly what that feels like. And your daughter is 9. He was quiet for a long moment. The arrangement you described, he said finally. Yes. Separate quarters. Paid work. Yes. The town will talk. The town is already talking, she said. I'm not sure there's a version of this where they don't. He looked at the window. Outside, 2 women were passing on the boardwalk, and at least one of them glanced toward the parlor window with the elaborate unconcern of someone who was looking on purpose. Her name was Clara, he said, without apparent transition. My wife, she was good with the children, natural at it. I never had to think about what they needed because she was always already there. He stopped. When she died, I thought I could just manage. That if I kept the ranch going and the bills paid and the roof sound, that was enough. He looked at his hands. I was wrong. Evelyn said nothing. Sometimes the right response was nothing. 3 months, he said. We try it for 3 months. You stay at Mrs. Pruitt's, come to the ranch days to help with the children and the house. I pay you a fair wage. After 3 months, we reassess. He looked up. If at any point it isn't working, you say so and you go with no ill will. Agreed, she said. He stood, picked up his hat. He was almost to the door when he turned back. Her name was Clara, he said again, like he wasn't sure he'd said it clearly enough. I wanted you to know that, before anything else. Evelyn thought she understood what he was telling her. Thank you for telling me, she said. The ranch was a 4-mile ride from town, and Evelyn made it on a borrowed horse she'd learned to manage respectably but not well. The land around Harlan Creek was wide and flat, and then abruptly not, the plains giving way to ridge lines that caught the morning light in long angles. In February, everything was white and gray, and the occasional dark line of a fence or tree, but she could see, even in the dead season, that the land was good, that it could be generous if it was worked. The house was a long, low structure with a covered porch that ran the width of the front. It was not elegant, but it was solid, the kind of building put up by someone who intended to stay. There was a barn, a chicken coop, a smokehouse. Everything in need of attention, but nothing in immediate disrepair. She noticed all of this with the practical eye of someone who had grown up in a household where things got done or they didn't get done, and knew the difference. Noah Hale was 5 years old, and he was suspicious of her in the complete uncomplicated way of a 5-year-old who has learned, at some primal level, that new people sometimes represent change, and change is not always good. He stood at the kitchen door when she arrived and stared at her without speaking. "Hello," she said. He stared. "My name is Evelyn. What's yours?" "He knows you know his name," Hazel said from behind him, practically, coming forward to take his hand. "He's just checking if you'll be honest about not knowing." Evelyn looked at this child and thought, 9 years old, managing a 5-year-old's emotional landscape. "Fair enough," she said to Noah. "I already know your name. I was being polite. That's different from lying." Noah considered this with considerable seriousness. Then he stepped aside to let her in. Odd. The kitchen was the worst room in the house. Not structurally. The stove was sound, the walls were dry, but it had the look of a room that had been kept functional rather than cared for. The surfaces were clean enough, but bare in the wrong way. There were no herbs hanging. The curtain over the window was a piece of feed sack fabric someone had tacked up and never replaced. Everything was in its place because it had to be, not because anyone had thought about where things should live. She didn't say any of this out loud. She put water on for coffee, found the tin by feel because no one had told her where it was, and when Hazel came in and said, "It's next to the flour," she said thank you, and moved the tin and proceeded. "Do you cook?" Hazel asked. "I do. Do you?" "Some things. I can do eggs and beans and biscuits. I can't do the big roast because I'm not—" She stopped. "I can't reach the top of the stove safely." "Then we'll figure out the stove together," Evelyn said. "What does your father like to eat?" Hazel thought about this. "He eats whatever there is. He doesn't say." "What did he like before?" A longer pause. "Mama made this thing with chicken and dried apples. I don't know how to make it." "Do you remember what it tasted like?" "Sort of sweet. And there was something, pepper, maybe." "We could try to figure it out." Hazel looked at her carefully. "You'd do that?" "Why wouldn't I?" The girl didn't answer, which was itself an answer. The first week was navigation, learning the shape of the days, what Noah needed in the morning, and what made him difficult in the afternoon, which chores Hazel had claimed as hers and would accept no help with, the chickens, the sweeping, and which she relinquished with obvious relief, the bread, the mending. Gideon was in and out, present at meals and absent otherwise, working the ranch with the focused joylessness of a man who had decided that work was the most reliable use of himself. He was not unkind. He was not warm. He was like a room with the windows nailed shut. Not dark exactly, but not ventilated. He thanked her for supper the first night with a formal nod. By the third day he was asking her questions, practical ones, about the children's schedules, about whether Noah had eaten enough, that were really, she understood, a way of checking that she was paying attention. By the end of the week, he was sitting at the kitchen table for a few minutes after supper, instead of going immediately to the barn for the last of his evening work. He didn't talk much, but he stayed. She noticed when things shifted with children. It was part of her training, part of her nature. Noah warmed first. He was 5, and 5-year-olds are less defended. By the second day, he was following her from room to room with the intensity of a small animal who has decided to investigate something. He didn't talk much, but he positioned himself where she was. Third day, he asked her to read to him. Fourth day, he fell asleep against her arm during the reading, and she sat very still for half an hour rather than disturb him. Hazel took longer. She was watchful in a way that was sadder than Noah's wariness, because it was older. She'd had more time to learn that things could be taken away. She helped with tasks, she answered questions, but she kept a little distance, a little buffer, the way children do when they've learned that attachment has a cost. On the Friday of the first week, Evelyn found her in the barn trying to fix a broken harness strap with her bare hands and insufficient string. She sat down beside her in the hay. "Can I help?" Hazel looked at the strap, then at her. "I'm supposed to do it." "Who said?" "Papa said harnesses are important and someone has to check them." "Did he say it had to be you?" Hazel didn't answer. "There's a piece of heavy thread in the mending basket," Evelyn said, "and a curved needle that's better for leather. Go get them and I'll show you." Hazel looked at her for a moment longer. Then she went. She came back with a thread and needle, and Evelyn showed her how to stitch leather. The angle, the pressure, the trick of keeping tension without tearing. Hazel's hands were good. She was precise in the way children sometimes are when they've been doing adult tasks long enough that they've had to develop adult attention. They sat in the hay and worked on the harness in the afternoon light, and for a while neither of them said anything, and it was the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. Then Hazel said, without looking up from the stitch, "I thought you'd leave after the first day." "Why?" "Because it's not what you came for." Evelyn kept her eyes on the leather. "What did I come for?" "A different life. Something better than what you had." She paused. "Not this." "What's wrong with this?" Hazel looked up then, with an expression that was complicated for a child. Something between exasperation and grief. "It's hard," she said. "Everything here is hard. And Papa doesn't—" She stopped. "Your Papa is carrying a lot." "I know," quietly. "I know he is. But sometimes carrying a lot and never putting it down looks the same as not caring, from the outside." Evelyn looked at this girl, 9 years old, watching her father from the outside and finding language for it. "I stayed," Evelyn said, "because of you. I want to be honest about that, not because this is easy or because it's what I expected, because a 9-year-old girl wrote 6 drafts of a letter, and that tells me something about who she is and what she deserves." Hazel looked down at the harness. Her jaw moved. "It was a wrong thing to do," she said. "I know it was." "Yes," Evelyn said, "and also a brave thing. Both can be true." The light moved. The barn was warm with animal smell and old hay. Outside somewhere, Gideon Hale was working the east fence line, and Noah was chasing the barn cat around the yard, and the mountains sat on the horizon the way they always did, without apology or explanation. Hazel finished the stitch. It was neat. It would hold. "Thank you," she said. She didn't specify what for, and Evelyn didn't ask. The rumors started in the second week. She heard them first from Mrs. Pruitt, who had the delivery of a woman reporting the weather. Unpleasant, possibly dangerous, entirely outside her control. "Margaret Aldrich is saying you came here without being asked," Mrs. Pruitt said, putting it plainly. "That you showed up with a forged letter you wrote yourself and used the children to get a foothold in a widower's household." Evelyn set down her cup. "That's inventive. She's saying you're the one who wrote to yourself." "I'm aware that's what she's saying." "You're not going to defend yourself?" Evelyn thought about this. "Against Margaret Aldrich?" Mrs. Pruitt allowed herself a brief, controlled smile. "She's connected to the Aldrich Land Company. Her husband's brother is involved in some of the property dealings in this valley." "I see. You might want to understand that," Mrs. Pruitt said, without elaborating, which told Evelyn that what remained unsaid was the important part. She didn't go looking for trouble, but she kept her eyes open after that, and she listened to what the town said when it thought she wasn't. And she began to understand slowly that Harlan Creek had an undercurrent she hadn't seen from the platform. That there were men in this town who had interests in the land around it, and that Gideon Hale's ranch, his refusal to sell it, his stubborn insistence on maintaining it against the odds, was something that some people found inconvenient. And an unmarried woman living on a widower's property, or even near it, a woman with no family and no local standing, was a vulnerability someone might choose to use. She didn't say anything about this to Gideon, not yet. She was still learning the shape of things. But at the end of the second week, when she arrived at the ranch one morning and found Noah in the yard alone, calling for Hazel in a voice that was getting close to fear, and went inside to find the girl at the kitchen table with her head on her arms, not crying, just exhausted in the bone-deep way of a child who has been managing too much for too long. She sat down next to her and put a hand on her back and did not say anything for a while. And when Hazel finally lifted her head, her face was just tired. "I dreamed about Mama," she said. "I keep trying to remember what she smelled like, and I can't anymore." Evelyn stayed. She did not have the right words, but she stayed, and sometimes that was the whole of it. Outside, the Wyoming winter pressed its weight against the windows, and the mountains stood where they always stood, and the ranch waited, the way things do when they have not yet decided whether they will survive. The third week began the way the first two had. Evelyn on a borrowed horse in the gray morning cold, the 4 miles between town and the Hale ranch passing under hooves that had finally stopped shying at the fence posts along the east road. She'd gotten better at the horse, The horse had gotten better at her. It was not a warm relationship, but it was functional, which she'd decided was enough. Gideon was already in the barn when she arrived, same as every morning, working before the light was full. She had learned not to call out to him when she came in. He wasn't unfriendly about it. He just startled in the particular way of a man who had spent 3 years alone except for 2 children, and startling made him embarrassed, and embarrassment made him quiet for the next hour. So she would come in, put her coat on the hook by the door, and start the stove. And eventually he would come through the kitchen on his way to the east field and say something brief and practical, like the pump's stiff this morning, or Noah's got a cough, keep an eye. And that was how they began most days. It wasn't warmth, but it was a kind of language. Noah's cough that week turned out to be nothing serious, a winter cold, the kind that made him miserable and clingy for 3 days and then evaporated. She made him a mustard poultice and kept him near the stove and read to him from the poetry book she'd brought from Ohio, which he didn't understand but found calming the way children sometimes find things calming. The rhythm of it, the voice, the certainty that someone was going to stay in the chair until it was over. On the second day of Noah's cold, Hazel came and sat on the other side of the kitchen and listened too. She pretended to be mending. She wasn't mending. Evelyn read an extra 2 pages and didn't mention it. It was small, all of it. None of it was dramatic. And yet she was aware, somewhere underneath the daily management of it, that something was happening in the house. Not a transformation. She was suspicious of that word, and of the neat before and after shape it implied. More like a slow change in pressure. The way a room feels different when someone opens a window it hasn't had open in a long time. Not fixed, just different, breathing a little. What she hadn't accounted for was how much the house had needed that, and how clearly she would see it once she was inside it. The kitchen was the room she understood first. Within the first week, she had reorganized it without making a production of it, moved things to where they were easier to reach, put the herbs she'd found in a neglected tin back into jars where they were visible, replaced the feed sack curtain with a piece of blue cotton she'd bought for 12 cents at the dry goods store in town. She said nothing about any of this. Gideon noticed. She could tell by the way his eyes moved across the room the first morning things were different. But he said nothing either, and that felt like permission, or at least not objection. Hazel noticed too, more directly. She came into the kitchen one morning and stopped and looked at the curtain with an expression that crossed several things at once. "Mama liked blue," she said. Evelyn was at the stove. She kept her voice casual, the way you do when something matters. "I didn't know. I just thought it would brighten the room." Hazel stood there a moment longer. Then she went to the table and sat down and said she would have liked it, and ate her breakfast and didn't say anything else about it, but the set of her shoulders was different, less braced. These were the increments. This was how it happened. Not in revelations, but in curtains and mustard poultices and an extra 2 pages of poetry. She had been there a month when she first saw the extent of the paperwork. She wasn't looking for it. She was searching for a needle and thread Hazel had misplaced, and had opened the wrong drawer in the desk in what passed for Gideon's office. A small room off the main hall that she hadn't been in before, stacked with ledgers and loose papers, and 2 coffee cups that had been there long enough to be artifacts. The drawer she opened had a folder of letters in it. She wasn't trying to read them, but one was sitting open, and the heading on it was from something called the Western Territorial Land Management Office, and the date on it was 6 weeks ago. And the first line she saw before she stopped herself said final notice of assessment. She closed the drawer. She found the needle and thread in the kitchen where it had always been. She went back to the mending, but she thought about it. 3 days later, she asked him about it directly. She decided that indirect was not a language she was fluent in, and that with Gideon in particular, circling a thing only gave him more time to build a wall around it. She waited until supper was done and the children were in bed and he was still at the kitchen table with his coffee, which had become, somewhere in the past 3 weeks, a regular thing. Him staying a little longer each evening, not talking, just present. "The letter's in your desk," she said, "from the land office." He looked at her. "I wasn't reading them," she said. "I saw enough to know there's a problem." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "It's being handled." "How?" "I said it's being handled." "Gideon." She used his name. She hadn't used it much, still defaulted to Mr. Hale out of habit, but she used it now. "I've been here a month. I get up 4 miles before dawn. I make your children breakfast, and I help your daughter understand that she doesn't have to carry this house by herself. I think I've earned a straight answer to a direct question." He looked at her across the table. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not quite irritation, not quite something else. More like a man having to recalibrate. "The assessments have been wrong for 2 years," he said finally. "They're valuing the east pasture at twice what it's worth. I filed disputes. They don't move." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "There's a company, a railroad company, Aldrich Continental, that's been buying land in this valley, ranches that get squeezed out by the assessments." He said it flatly, like someone reading from a ledger. "I've been told my water access is under dispute. I've been told there are improvements that need to be registered and taxed. Last month I got a letter telling me I had an outstanding debt I don't have with a bank I've never done business with." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "And you've been managing this alone." "It's my problem to manage." "It was your problem," she said. "I'm not sure that's still entirely true." He looked at her again. That same recalibrating look. "You're a schoolteacher." "I was a schoolteacher. I was also the daughter of a man who ran a dry goods store and got cheated by a supply company when I was 14. And I watched my father spend 2 years learning how to document a fraud and fight it through a county clerk's office." She paused. "I know how paper works. I know how to read what it's actually saying and what it's pretending to say." Gideon was quiet. "Let me look at them," she said. "Not to solve anything, just to look." He didn't answer that night, but the next morning, when she arrived, the folder was sitting on the kitchen table. She spent 3 evenings going through it while the children slept. The papers were worse than she'd hoped, and better than she'd feared. The assessments were fraudulent in a way that was almost too consistent. The same inflated figures, the same references to the same set of guidelines that didn't appear to actually exist in the territorial code she found referenced in the county records Mrs. Pruitt let her borrow from a neighbor. The debt letter was from a bank in a city 200 miles away with a letterhead that looked legitimate until you looked at the charter numbers, which didn't match the territorial banking registry. Someone was doing this methodically. This wasn't opportunism. This was a system. She wrote it all down in a notebook she bought at the dry goods store, organizing it the way she organized lesson plans, by date, by document type, by what each paper claimed versus what could be verified. She was not a lawyer. She couldn't make this go away, but she could make it legible, and legibility was the beginning of being able to fight something. She showed Gideon on a Thursday evening. He sat at the table and read through her notes without saying anything for a long time. Noah had fallen asleep on the settle in the corner, one arm dangling off the edge. Outside, the wind was doing what Wyoming wind did in February. "You did all this in 3 nights?" he said. 2.5. I didn't sleep well the second night." He looked at the notebook, then at her. Why? She knew what he was asking, not how. Why? Why she'd spent her nights on this. What she wanted from it. What her angle was. "Because your children need this ranch," she said. "And because whoever is doing this is doing it to other people too. And because—" She stopped, looked for the honest thing. "Because I'm here. And I can. That's all." He looked down at the notebook again. His jaw worked, the way it did when he was processing something he hadn't made room for. "There are other families," he said after a while. "The Galloways north of here, Brent Calloway and his brother. At least 4 others I know of who've had the same letters, the same assessments." He paused. "I didn't know the pattern was this clear. It's clear when you put it in one place." He was quiet. Then, almost to himself, "I thought I was just having bad luck." "You were having a strategy used against you," she said. "That's different." He looked at her for a moment. A long moment. The kind that had something in it. She didn't look away. "I'll talk to Calloway," he said. "He keeps records. He's been fighting the water assessment for 18 months. A pause. "If we could show that the same office is issuing the same fraudulent numbers to multiple ranchers, you'd have something worth taking to the territorial level," Evelyn said. "Yes." He nodded once, the way he decided things. Then he went to the barn and came back with a second ledger, older and more battered, and sat down across from her and opened it to a page of his own notes from 2 years ago, and they sat at the table until nearly 11 going through documents while Noah snored softly in the corner and the wind pushed at the windows. It was not a warm moment, exactly, but it was something, a joining of purpose. She felt it, and thought he probably did too, though neither of them said so. The talk in town had not stopped. If anything, it had gotten more specific. She heard it secondhand mostly, through Mrs. Pruitt, who reported it without editorializing, through the dry goods owner, who was friendly and apologetic about it, through the look on people's faces at the post office when she came in for Gideon's mail, which she'd started collecting to save him the trip. It had moved from the general, a woman alone, no family, no standing, to the specific, everyone knows she manufactured the whole arrangement, to the pointed, Aldrich says she's an opportunist, probably after the land deed. Margaret Aldrich in particular had become a dedicated source. Evelyn understood by now why. Margaret's brother-in-law sat on the county land commission. Her husband had dealings with the railroad company. Evelyn's presence at the Hale Ranch, or her competence there, specifically, her ability to look at paperwork and see what it was inconvenient in a way that the Aldriches had apparently decided to preempt. She had not said this out loud to anyone except Mrs. Pruitt, who had looked at her with something that was close to satisfaction. "You're sharper than you let on," Mrs. Pruitt had said. "I let on plenty," Evelyn said. "People just see what they expect." The difficulty was that the talk had begun reaching the children. Hazel heard things at school. The particular brutality of children passing along adult judgments without understanding them. Just the tone, just the meanness. She came home one afternoon quiet in the wrong way, and it took until after supper, when Evelyn was washing up and Hazel was drying, before it came out. "Emma Calloway said you're trying to steal Papa's land." Evelyn kept washing. "What did you say?" "I said Emma Calloway didn't know what she was talking about." "What happened then?" "She said her mother said it, so it must be true." Hazel dried a plate with more force than necessary. "Her mother got it from Mrs. Aldrich." "I see. Is it true?" Hazel asked, flat, direct, looking at her. Evelyn turned to face her. "No, it's not. I'm helping your father document land fraud that's being used to try to take this ranch, by the same people whose names you just mentioned." Hazel stared at her. "That's the truth," Evelyn said, "and I'd rather tell you the whole truth and let you decide what to do with it than tell you a comfortable version that doesn't help you understand what's happening." The girl stood very still for a moment. Then she turned back to the dishes and dried the next plate and said very quietly, "Okay." It wasn't agreement exactly. It wasn't trust entirely. But it was something. What happened next surprised Evelyn more than she let on. 2 days later, Hazel came to her with a piece of paper, folded carefully, the edges neat. "I took notes," she said, "at school. The things Emma Calloway said, and the things Lucy Briggs said last week that I didn't think were important, but now I think maybe they were." Evelyn unfolded the paper. Hazel had written, in her careful, uneven hand, 3 separate conversations she'd overheard or been part of. Names, dates, what had been said, what she'd been able to verify, or not. It was not sophisticated, but it was thorough, and it was organized. Evelyn looked at the paper for a moment. "Your father didn't teach you to do this," she said. "No," Hazel said. "Your mother?" A pause. "She kept a journal. She wrote down things that happened so she wouldn't forget them." Hazel's voice stayed even with effort. "I used to watch her. She said that things that aren't written down get lost, and then no one can prove they happened." Evelyn looked at the girl. 9 years old and already carrying her mother's philosophy like a tool she'd decided to keep. "This is good," she said. She meant it. "This is genuinely useful. Thank you." Hazel looked at the paper, then at Evelyn. Something shifted in her expression, something that had been held back, some small door opening just a crack. "Can I help more? With the documenting?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "You can." The day Gideon came back from Calloway's with his jaw set and something different in his eyes was the day Evelyn knew the situation was moving toward something she hadn't fully prepared for. He came through the door at dusk, didn't take off his coat, stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat still on and said, "Calloway has 2 years of records. Matches exactly what we found in mine. He's talked to the Galloways, same pattern there. They've been working with a land attorney in Cheyenne who thinks we might have enough for a formal challenge." "That's good," Evelyn said. "There was a man at Calloway's when I got there." He came all the way into the kitchen then, pulled out a chair, sat in it heavily. "From the railroad company. He'd come to make an offer. Cash purchase, above current market." He paused. Calloway told him to leave. But the man said something before he went. He said, Gideon looked at the table. He said that situations like this have a way of getting worse before they get better, and that men with families should think carefully about what they're protecting and what they're risking. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. He was threatening him, Evelyn said. He was being careful about how he said it. Gideon's jaw worked, which is almost worse. Noah appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt, hair flat on one side from sleep. Papa? Gideon's face changed. Not all the way to soft. It didn't quite do that, but something in it eased. He held out one arm, and Noah crossed the kitchen and leaned into his side, and Gideon put his arm around him and sat like that for a moment. Go back to bed, he said, not unkindly. I'll come check on you. Noah went, looking back once over his shoulder. Gideon stayed at the table after that, his coffee cooling. Evelyn sat across from him and didn't fill the silence with unnecessary words. After a while, he said, I keep thinking, when Clara was sick at the end, she made me promise I wouldn't let this place go. She grew up moving from town to town. Her father lost every property he ever had. He paused. She wanted the children to have something that couldn't be taken. That was the word she used. Something that couldn't be taken. Evelyn looked at him. I can't tell her I'm losing it, he said. He said it quietly, almost to himself, and she understood immediately what he meant. Not that Clara was alive to tell, but that the failure felt like a conversation with her anyway, felt like answering for something. You're not losing it yet, Evelyn said, and you're not fighting it alone anymore. He looked at her, his eyes were tired, not defeated. She'd come to understand the difference in him. Just tired, the way a person gets when they've been the only one holding something for too long. No, he said, not alone. It was not a declaration of anything. It was just a man acknowledging a fact that he hadn't been able to acknowledge before. But she felt it settle between them the way things do when they're true. Without fuss, without ceremony, just settling in and staying. She rode back to town that evening in the dark, the horse finding the road by feel, the mountains invisible above the tree line but present in the cold coming off them. The stars were out, sharp and indifferent, the way Wyoming stars were, with no warmth in them but plenty of light. She thought about Hazel's notes, about the folder of documents and the notebook she'd made of them, about Gideon's face when he'd said not alone and meant it, about the man from the railroad company who had stood in Calloway's yard and made careful, non-threatening threats. She thought about how much she had not expected any of this when she'd packed that trunk in Ohio. She had expected difficulty and a hard life and a practical arrangement. She had expected to be useful in the ways she knew how to be useful. She had not expected to find herself sitting across from a man at 11 at night, going through documents, both of them working toward the same thing without having agreed to. She had not expected to care, the specific way she'd come to care, about whether this particular patch of Wyoming land survived what was being done to it. She had not expected Hazel's notes, carefully folded, had not expected Noah's small weight against her arm while she read, had not expected the blue curtain to matter the way it had. She was still not sure what to call any of it, but she was sure, clearly, without sentimentality, that she was not going to leave. The horse found the road. The stars stayed sharp. The mountains held the cold the way they always had, indifferent to what happened below them, but they're all the same, solid and permanent, the kind of thing a person could look at when everything else was uncertain and feel, if not comfort, then at least the steadiness of something that intended to remain. She rode on. The man from the railroad company came to the Hale Ranch on a Tuesday, which Evelyn had always found to be the least remarkable day of the week, the kind of day nothing was supposed to happen on. His name was Virgil Crane. He arrived in a good coat and a hired buggy, which announced money the way good coats and hired buggies always did in towns that didn't have much of it. He was somewhere in his mid-50s with a broad face that had learned to arrange itself into pleasantness without any of the underlying architecture that pleasantness usually requires. He tied his horse at the post with the ease of a man who had done this many times, at many ranches, and was not anticipating any outcome he hadn't already planned for. Evelyn saw him from the kitchen window and knew before he knocked that this was the man Gideon had told her about. The one from Calloway's yard. She opened the door before he could knock twice. He looked at her with a brief recalibration. He'd expected Gideon, or perhaps no one. and finding a woman at the door required him to reshuffle something. He did it quickly and smoothly, which told her the reshuffling was practiced. "Ma'am, I'm here to see Gideon Hale. Is he available?" "He's on the East Field," she said. "I can get him." "I'd appreciate that." She didn't invite him in. She went to the barn, told the hand who was mucking stalls to find Gideon, and came back to stand on the porch. Crane stood in the yard with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the property with the particular attention of a man assigning value to things. "Nice place," he said conversationally. "It is," she said. "Ranch land's a hard life." "Most good things are." He glanced at her then. A small recalibration again. He hadn't expected her to talk back. Or maybe he had, and was deciding what grade of talking back this was. Gideon came around the side of the barn with his coat half-buttoned and his expression already closed, the way it went when he was preparing to deal with something unpleasant, and was intent on not letting the unpleasantness show. "Mr. Crane," he said. "Mr. Hale, good to finally meet you in person." Crane extended a hand. Gideon shook it briefly. "I thought it was time we spoke directly, rather than through letters. I always find these things go better face to face." "What things?" Gideon said. Crane smiled. It was a very good smile. "I represent Aldrich Continental's Land Acquisition Division. You've received our correspondence." "I have." "Then you know we're prepared to offer a fair price for this property. More than fair, given the current assessment climate." He said assessment climate the way a man says something he knows is a weapon, but wants to sound like he's talking about weather. "There's a great deal of uncertainty in the valley right now. A lot of ranchers are finding that holding on costs more than letting go." "I'm not letting go," Gideon said. Flat, final. Crane nodded, as if this were the answer he'd expected, and it didn't particularly concern him. "I understand the attachment. A family place. Your wife—" He paused. "I'm sorry for your loss, truly. But the children—" A glance toward the house. At Evelyn, specifically. "You have a lot to consider beyond just the land itself." The way he looked at Evelyn when he said it was not accidental. She understood what he was doing, pointing at her presence as evidence of something fragile, something that could be leveraged. The implication was not subtle. You have complications. We could make those complications bigger. Gideon had noticed. His jaw had gone tighter. "I've heard your offer," Gideon said. My answer is no. It was no in the letter, and it's no now." Crane held the smile for another moment. Then he reached into his coat and produced a folded document which he held out. "The county land office issued a revised assessment this morning. I thought you should have a copy before it arrived through official channels, as a courtesy." Gideon took the paper. Evelyn moved to his shoulder to read it. The East Pasture assessment had been revised upward again, this time to a figure that was nearly 3 times what she'd documented in her notes as the legitimate market value. The accompanying page listed 2 separate unpaid tax obligations and referenced an outstanding improvement registration debt that hadn't existed in any of the previous paperwork. She'd seen fabricated numbers before, in her father's situation, but those had been sloppy. These were thorough. Whoever was preparing these documents was careful, and the care made them more dangerous, not less, because careful fraud looked like legitimate process until you knew exactly where to look. She looked at Gideon. His eyes were moving across the page with the expression of a man reading something he already knew was wrong, but didn't yet know how to prove. "Give us a few days to review this," she said. Crane looked at her again. This time the recalibration took a beat longer. "You're the woman from the platform," he said. Not hostile, just placing her. "I am." "You have an interest in this property?" "I have an interest in accurate paperwork," she said. "These figures don't match the territorial land schedule. I'd like to understand what authority revised them." Something shifted in Crane's expression then. Something behind the practiced pleasantness. A tightening. He looked at Gideon. "You might want to think about who you're taking counsel from, Mr. Hale. A woman with no standing in this county, no property, no family." "She can read," Gideon said, "which is more than I can say for whoever prepared this assessment." Crane looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up his hat. 3 days, he said pleasantly. "The office will need a response by Friday, or the obligations go to collection. I'd hate for it to reach that point." Another look at the house. at the upstairs window, where Hazel had appeared without either of them noticing, watching. For the children's sake. He climbed back into his buggy and drove down the lane without looking back, which was the move of a man who didn't think he needed to. Gideon stood in the yard with the document in his hand for a long moment after the buggy disappeared. 3 days, he said. We can work with 3 days, Evelyn said. He looked at her. Something in his face was raw in a way she hadn't seen before. Not quite fear, not quite anger, the specific look of a person whose tolerance for being pushed has finally met its limit. He looked at my daughter, he said, when he made the threat. He looked at Hazel. I know. That's what I can't. He stopped, pressed his lips together. A man who will use a child as a pressure point is a particular kind of man. Yes, she said. He is. And that kind of man tends to get sloppy when he thinks he's already won. She held out her hand for the document. Let me take this apart tonight. There will be something wrong in it that they didn't expect us to find. She found it by 11 that night. The improvement registration debt referenced a county ordinance number that didn't exist in the 1879 Territorial Code, the year it cited as its authority. She'd sent a letter 3 weeks earlier to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne requesting a copy of the registered ordinances, and Mrs. Pruitt's neighbor had received back a printed list 2 days ago that Evelyn had been meaning to cross-reference. She hadn't gotten to it yet. She got to it now. Ordinance 7-14C. It was not on the list. It was not adjacent to anything on the list. It had been invented. She sat back in her chair at Mrs. Pruitt's kitchen table and looked at that for a long moment. Someone in the county land office was generating fraudulent legal citations. That wasn't a clerical error. That wasn't aggressive interpretation of existing law. That was forgery on official documents. And if it was in Gideon's revised assessment, it was almost certainly in the assessments that had been issued to Callaway, the Galloways, and everyone else whose land the railroad wanted. She wrote it all down twice, once in her own notebook, once on a clean sheet she could give to Gideon. Then she sat there in the quiet of Mrs. Pruitt's kitchen and thought about what it meant to have found this, and what it was going to cost to use it. Because finding it and surviving what came after were two different problems. She rode to the ranch before sunrise. Gideon was already up. She could see the lamp in the kitchen from the road. He opened the door before she reached the porch, which meant he'd heard the horse, or he hadn't slept either. She showed him the document and the list and the absence where the ordinance number should have been. He read it twice. Slowly, the second time. Then he set it down on the table and looked at it the way a man looks at something that has just changed the shape of what he thought he was dealing with. This isn't just bad assessments, he said. No. Someone in that office is creating false legal authority. Everything built on that ordinance number is fraudulent. She paused. Which means the debt they're threatening to send to Collection Friday doesn't legally exist. Can we prove that before Friday? We can document it. Whether a county court will move on documentation in 3 days, she stopped. Probably not. But if we send copies to the territorial governor's land office before Friday, we create a record that makes any collection action legally questionable. It won't stop them immediately, but it makes them vulnerable. Gideon was quiet. He got up, poured coffee, set a cup in front of her without asking. She'd noticed he'd started doing that somewhere in the past 2 weeks. The automatic small hospitality, the unconscious assumption that she was staying long enough to want coffee. She didn't think he was aware of it. I need to talk to Callaway today, he said. If this ordinance number is in his paperwork too, it almost certainly is. Then we take it to Cheyenne together. Multiple ranchers, same fraudulent citation, documented in parallel. He sat back down. That's harder to ignore than one man. Yes. She looked at her coffee. There's something else. He waited. Crane knows we're looking at the paperwork. He knows because I said so, yesterday, to his face. That means by tonight the people behind this will know that someone on this ranch can read their documents and find the holes. She said it carefully, not trying to soften it. That makes this more dangerous, not less. They will push harder before we can get to Cheyenne. He was looking at her steadily. I want you to understand that, she said, before we go further. I understand it, he said. It could come through the children, through Hazel specifically, the school, the town. She hated saying it out loud. It could come through me. My standing here is thin. They could make it thinner. I know. He said it quietly, and she heard something in it, something that wasn't just acknowledgement. Evelyn. He hadn't used her given name before. She noticed. I know what you're risking. I'm not asking you to risk more than you already have. I'm not asking you to protect me from it, she said. I'm telling you what the board looks like so we can play it correctly. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read. Not quite the closed look he'd worn for most of the first weeks. Something more open than that. Something that had cost him something to allow. You should have been a lawyer, he said. Not quite a joke. More like a fact he'd arrived at reluctantly. I should have been a lot of things, she said. I'm this. It came through the children, as she'd predicted, but not the way she'd expected. 2 days before Friday, Hazel came home from school with a note from the schoolmaster. A thin, nervous man named Beggs, who had been in Harlan Creek for 4 years and had apparently decided that 4 years was long enough to understand where the local power sat. The note informed Gideon that due to concerns raised by members of the school board, Hazel's enrollment was under review pending clarification of the family's standing in the community. Standing in the community. The phrase was doing a great deal of work. Hazel handed over the note with the careful expression of a child who has already read it and understood more of it than she was supposed to. She said nothing. She went to the kitchen and started on supper with the focused efficiency of someone who needed to do something with their hands. Gideon read the note at the table. His face went through several things. He stood up and put on his coat. Where are you going? Evelyn said. To talk to Beggs. That's what they want, she said. He stopped. They want you at Beggs's door tonight, angry, so that by morning it's the story of Gideon Hale threatening the schoolmaster, which becomes the story of Gideon Hale being the kind of man who shouldn't be allowed to maintain property in this community. He stood there with his coat on and his jaw working. I know, she said. I know exactly what you want to do, and it will cost you the ranch. He looked at her. She looked back. This was the longest they'd held each other's gaze since the platform. Then what do we do? He said. The anger was still there, but she could hear it. But underneath it, the question was genuine. He was asking, trusting her to have an answer. We finish the packet for Cheyenne tonight. We send it tomorrow morning, with Calloway's name on it alongside yours, and I go talk to Beggs. She paused. Not you, me. You? A school teacher talking to a schoolmaster about a child's enrollment is not a threat. It's a professional conversation. He has a great deal less cover for refusing me than he does for refusing you. She said it plainly. Let me go. He took off his coat and sat back down, which was, she had come to understand, the way Gideon Hale said, you're right, when he couldn't quite bring himself to say it with words. She went to see Beggs that evening. He was a small, unhappy man sitting in a small, unhappy office, and he spent the first 10 minutes of their conversation explaining at length that the matter was out of his hands, that the board had concerns, that these were difficult times. She let him finish. Then she set her own teaching certificates on his desk, next to a copy of the Territorial Education Code she'd borrowed from a lawyer's office in town, and a brief letter she'd drafted outlining that the removal of a student from enrollment for reasons unrelated to academic conduct or disciplinary action was in direct violation of territorial education statute, and that she was prepared to file a formal complaint with the Territorial Education Board if Hazel's enrollment was not confirmed in writing by end of week. She had spent an hour that afternoon figuring out whether any such statute existed. It did, barely. A single paragraph in the 1881 Territorial Code that nobody had bothered to test, but barely was enough. Beggs looked at the papers for a long time. This won't make you popular, he said finally. I'm not trying to be popular, she said. I'm trying to keep a 9-year-old in school. Those are different projects. He confirmed the enrollment in writing the next morning. She suspected it cost him something. She found it difficult to be sorry about that. The packet went to Cheyenne on Thursday with Gideon's name and Calloway's, and the supporting documentation of 3 other ranchers who had agreed when Calloway reached them to add their records to the submission. 7 families, same fraudulent ordinance number, same inflated assessments, same pattern of manufactured debt. Organized, clear, cross-referenced. Friday came. No collection agent appeared. No further notice arrived from the county office. The silence felt like something holding its breath. On Saturday morning, Gideon told her he needed to check the fence line on the south pasture, which was a job that took most of the day and wasn't urgent. She knew it wasn't urgent because he'd mentioned it twice in the past week, in a casual way that suggested it was the kind of thing you did when things were quiet. He asked if she could manage the children. "Of course," she said. He was already halfway out the door when he turned back. This had become a habit of his, making his exit and then returning for the thing he'd actually meant to say. "There's a place," he said, "up the ridge past the south pasture. Clara's buried there. I put her up there because she liked the view." He said it to the doorframe, not quite to her. "I've been meaning to go up there for a while. I thought I might today, while I'm out." Evelyn understood what he was telling her, not asking permission, not issuing an invitation, just telling her, as if it mattered that she know. "Take your time," she said. He nodded and went. She thought about that for the rest of the morning while she helped Noah with a drawing he'd been working on and listened to Hazel read aloud from a primer. She was reading well above her grade level, Evelyn had noticed, though no one had apparently told her that yet. She thought about what it meant for a man to say that out loud. "Clara's buried there. I've been meaning to go." A man who had been carrying something alone for 3 years, who had built walls by labor and silence, saying that to her in the kitchen door on a Saturday morning. Not as a confession, just as a fact he needed to share with someone. She thought about the packed trunk in Ohio, the room that was always too quiet, the way she'd read that letter 3 times before putting it down, some instinct in her recognizing something true in its plainness. She had not expected any of this. She was not sure she had the language for what it was becoming, but she knew, sitting in the kitchen with Noah's drawing and Hazel's careful reading and the sound of the Wyoming wind doing what it always did, that she had not been wrong to stay, that whatever this was, this hard, imperfect, complicated thing, it was real in a way her life in Ohio had not been real for a long time. It asked more of her, and it gave back more. She was still thinking about all of this, still trying to find the right shape for it, when Gideon came back at dusk with mud on his boots and something different in his face, not resolved, not healed, but opened in some small way like a window that had been stuck for years and had finally given. He sat down at the kitchen table. He didn't take off his coat right away. He sat there for a moment with his hands flat on the table. "I talked to her," he said. "Up there." He wasn't embarrassed about it exactly, but he said it carefully. "I told her what's been happening. The letters, the fraud, all of it." A pause. "I told her about you." Evelyn waited. "She would have liked you," he said. Not as a comfort, as a considered judgment. She had no patience for people who weren't straight with her. She would have liked someone who reads a fraudulent ordinance number at 11 at night and comes to the door at dawn with the answer. Evelyn looked at her coffee cup. I don't know how to do this," he said. "I want to be honest about that. I don't know how to—" He stopped. Tried again. "I've been thinking about what happens after Cheyenne. If it works, if we stop them." He looked at her. "I've been thinking about what you go back to, in Ohio, or wherever, and Another stop. She waited. "I don't want you to go," he said. Flat and direct, the way he said things that cost him. "I know this isn't what you came here for. I know it's not. The arrangement isn't—" He pressed his lips together. "I'm asking you to stay, not as a housekeeper, not as an arrangement." He met her eyes. I know this isn't a simple thing to ask. I'm not a simple situation. The children, the ranch, all of it." A breath. "But I'm asking." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the last of the light was going off the mountains in long pink lines, the way it did on clear evenings in February, beautiful and cold and entirely indifferent. She had known, she thought, had known for some time. The blue curtain, the coffee he set down without asking, the way he'd said not alone that night and meant it. She had known, and she'd been waiting to see if he knew too. "I need to tell you something first," she said. He waited. He was good at waiting when he chose to be. "I came here for the same reason your daughter wrote those letters," she said. "Because I was lonely in a way I'd stopped putting words to. Because my life in Ohio was safe and sufficient and completely without this." She gestured at the room, the house, meaning more than the room. I need you to know that. I'm not doing this out of obligation or pity or because I have nowhere else to go. I'm doing it because I want to. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face settled. Not relief exactly. More like a man who had been braced against something and found that it wasn't going to hit him. Okay, he said. And I need you to know I'm going to keep reading your paperwork, she said, and arguing with you when I think you're wrong, and occasionally terrifying your schoolmaster. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, close enough. I know, he said. Okay, she said. Then yes. He nodded once, the way he decided things. They sat there for a little while in the kitchen, with the last of the day going down outside, and the stove ticking in the quiet, and it was not a perfect moment. His hands were still muddy from the ridge. She was tired from 2 nights of poor sleep. Neither of them were the people they'd expected to become. But it was true, and truth in a kitchen on a February evening was its own kind of thing. Hazel appeared in his doorway, read the room in the way that children who have been paying close adult attention for years are able to read rooms, and said nothing. She simply went to the stove and checked the pot she'd had simmering, and stirred it, and said, "Supper's ready," in a voice that was carefully normal. But when she turned back to the stove, Evelyn caught the edge of her expression. The girl was smiling, small, private, and so relieved it was almost painful to see. She had written 6 drafts, and it had taken 4 months, and a fraud investigation, and a Tuesday with a man in a good coat. But it had gotten to here. Here was not easy. Here was not finished. But here was real, and it was theirs, and outside the mountains still held their cold and their permanence, and the ranch waited to see what would come next. They were married on a Wednesday in March, which was not the day either of them had planned because neither of them had planned a day at all. It happened the way practical things sometimes happen between practical people. Not with ceremony building toward it, but with a morning that began like any other and then became something else. Gideon had ridden into town to file a response at the county clerk's office, a procedural document Evelyn had spent 2 evenings drafting, and she had ridden in separately to collect mail and buy flour. They ran into each other outside the clerk's office, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that the clerk, a heavy-set man named Dorsey, who had been watching the Hale situation with the uneasy attention of someone who knows which way the wind is blowing and isn't sure yet which side of the window to be on, looked up at both of them standing together at his counter and said, carefully, "You know, a formal legal marriage would complicate their collection claims considerably. Married couples' jointly held property has a different standing than a single man's holdings with a household employee." He said household employee with the particular delicacy of a man who knew that wasn't quite what she was, but didn't have a better word available. Gideon looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Gideon. "We're engaged," Gideon said, which was, she reflected, one way of describing what had been decided in the kitchen on that February Saturday, though neither of them had used that word at the time. Then a marriage license filed today would be reflected in county records before Friday's session, Dorsey said, and went back to his paperwork. They stood outside afterward in the pale March cold, the main street of Harlan Creek doing its usual business around them, and Gideon said, "It's a practical reason." "It is," she said. "That doesn't mean it's the only reason." "I know. I just want to be clear that it isn't." "Gideon," she said, "I know." He looked at her for a moment. That recalibrating look she'd come to understand was his version of tenderness, a man checking whether what he was feeling was actually there, making sure it was real before he let it mean anything. "There's a judge who comes through on Wednesdays," he said. "Mrs. Pruitt could witness." "She'll want to be asked properly," Evelyn said. "She has opinions about being informed versus being asked." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. "Do you want a different day?" She thought about it honestly. She thought about the dress she'd brought from Ohio, the better of her two, which was gray wool and perfectly respectable, but not the kind of thing a person imagined wearing for this. She thought about flowers, which would not exist in Harlan Creek in March, and a cake, which would require more planning than they had time for, and all the accumulated architecture of how weddings were supposed to look. Then she thought about Dorsey's counter, and the Friday deadline, and Virgil Crane in his good coat making careful, non-threatening threats. And she thought, the ranch first. Everything else is details. "Wednesday is fine," she said. Mrs. Pruitt was asked properly and accepted with a brief nod and the expression of a woman who had been expecting this for some time and was primarily relieved that people had stopped being inefficient about it. She wore her good dress and brought a small cake she claimed to have made the previous week for another occasion, which Evelyn was fairly certain was not true, but appreciated anyway. Hazel and Noah were there. Noah wore his church clothes and stood very straight with the seriousness of a 5-year-old assigned an important task he doesn't fully understand. Hazel wore her best dress and stood beside Evelyn during the brief ceremony with an expression that was working very hard to stay composed. The judge was a laconic man named Prentice, who had performed enough frontier marriages to have stripped the ceremony to its essential architecture. The words that needed to be said, the acknowledgement that mattered, and nothing superfluous. It took 11 minutes. Gideon said "I do" in the same tone he used for decisions he'd made up his mind about and wasn't going to revisit. Evelyn said it in a tone that she hoped communicated the same thing. Afterward, outside in the pale sun, Hazel took her hand, not performatively, just reached over and took it, and held it for a moment, and Evelyn held back. And that was the whole of it, and it was enough. The marriage license was filed with Dorsey before noon. He recorded it with the careful neutrality of a man placing a piece on a board, and Evelyn thought she saw something in his posture when he stamped it. A small private adjustment, like a man who has decided belatedly which way the wind is going. Bam! The response from Cheyenne came 10 days later, and it was not what any of them had fully allowed themselves to expect. It arrived as 2 letters in the same envelope, which was unusual. The first was a formal acknowledgement from the Territorial Land Commissioner's office, signed by a deputy commissioner named Hartwell, stating that the submission had been received and was under preliminary review. Standard language. The kind of letter that meant very little on its own. The second letter was shorter, unsigned, written in a hand that was careful in the way that suggested someone being careful on purpose. It said only, "The Commissioner is aware of Aldrich Continental's activities in Harlan Creek Valley. You are not the first submission we have received. A territorial investigator will be in the region within the month. Keep your records secured and do not discuss this correspondence publicly." She read it twice. Then she handed it to Gideon without saying anything. He read it, set it down. "Someone in that office already knows," he said. "Someone in that office has been waiting for documentation they could use," she said. "We weren't the first to complain. We were the first to show up with organized evidence." He was quiet for a moment. "The month. At most. They'll push harder before then." He wasn't asking. They both understood how this worked by now. Cornered power didn't surrender. It escalated. "Yes," she said, "which means we need more ranchers on record before the investigator arrives, not just Calloway and the Galloways. The more names attached to this, the harder it is to dismiss." She looked at the letter. "And we need the original document secured somewhere they can't get to. Not here, not at Calloway's." "Mrs. Pruitt," he said immediately. She considered that. Mrs. Pruitt's boarding house was in town, central, public, visible in a way that cut both ways. "Her root cellar is solid," she said, "and she's not easily threatened." "No," he agreed. "She is not." The next 2 weeks had the quality of moving through deep water. Everything effortful, everything slow, everything requiring more resistance than it should have. Gideon rode to every ranch in the valley that he thought might have received similar assessments, which meant 6 additional properties across a 40-mile range. Evelyn drafted the letters he delivered, formal, specific, asking each family to compile their land office correspondence with dates and document numbers, asking them to confirm whether a specific ordinance number appeared in any of their paperwork. She kept copies of everything in a second set of notes she stored in her own trunk at Mrs. Pruitt's, separate from the main documents. 3 of the 6 responded immediately. 1 was too frightened. 1 had already sold. The 6th, a family named Marsh, whose patriarch was 64 years old and had been fighting the assessments alone for 18 months, rode to the Hale Ranch unannounced one evening, sat down at the kitchen table, and put a stack of papers in front of Evelyn without preamble. "My son said I should wait," he said. He was a compact, weathered man with hands that had been broken and healed wrong more than once. "I'm done waiting." She looked at his documents. The ordinance number appeared in 4 separate filings. His documentation was meticulous. He'd been recording dates and reference numbers since the first letter arrived, with the stubborn thoroughness of a man who knew he was right and was determined that eventually someone would have to see it. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "this is excellent." He looked at her. "You're the school teacher," he said. "I was, yes. My granddaughter is in the school here. Hazel Hale tutored her in arithmetic last fall." He paused. "She's a good girl, your daughter." It was the first time someone had said that to her. Your daughter. She felt it land somewhere she hadn't prepared. "She is," she said, and meant it completely. The escalation came through the bank. Not a collection agent this time. Gideon received a letter from the Territorial Savings and Land Bank in Casper, a real institution, one he'd actually done business with, which made it worse, informing him that a lien had been placed against the property by the county land office pending resolution of outstanding assessments, and that until the lien was resolved, the bank was required to freeze his account pending review. It was a Friday. The account freeze meant the ranch hand couldn't be paid. It meant the feed order for next month couldn't be placed. It meant a dozen downstream practical consequences that arrived in the mind all at once, like a door opening onto cold. Gideon put the letter on the table and stood with his back to her for a moment. "They're not waiting for the investigator," he said. "No," she said. "They found out about the submission." He turned. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were steady, which she'd learned was what Gideon Hale looked like when he was past the point of being afraid and had moved into something harder and quieter. "What do we do?" "We go to Callaway," she said. "Today. We need him to go to the bank in person with his documents and request a formal hold on any lien actions pending territorial investigation. He has a history with the bank manager. You told me that. Use it." She was already thinking through the sequence. "And I need to send a wire to Deputy Commissioner Hartwell's office today. Not a letter. A wire. Citing the bank action as a deliberate attempt to interfere with a pending territorial investigation. Can we do that? Cite a pending investigation? They told us one was coming. That makes it pending." She met his eyes. "I'm going to be flexible about the exact language." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. "You're going to be flexible." "I am a practical person," she said. He picked up his hat. "I'll get the horses." Callaway met them at his gate like a man who had been watching the road, which, it turned out, he had been. He'd received his own letter from the same bank that morning. He was 62 years old and had been a rancher in this valley for 30 years, and he stood in his yard with that letter in his hand with the specific kind of fury that belongs to a person who has been patient for a very long time and has finally reached the bottom of it. "Tell me what to do," he said to Evelyn without preamble. She told him. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. Then he said, "The bank manager is a man named Phipps. We've had our differences, but he's not dirty. He's just cautious. Show him the right papers and he'll hold. Can you get to him today?" "I can get to him in the next hour." She handed him a copy of the letter to Hartwell's office she'd drafted in Gideon's saddlebag on the ride over, written on the back of an invoice. It was not elegant. It was exactly what it needed to be. Callaway read it, looked at her, and said, "Gideon, you found a good one," with the directness of a man who had no time left for anything but blunt truth. Gideon said, "I know it," without looking at her, which was its own kind of thing, chap. The wire to Hartwell's office went from the telegraph station in Harlan Creek at 2 in the afternoon. The telegraph operator, a young man named Willis, who was 23 and had been in the territory for 8 months, looked at the message twice before sending it. "This is going to the commissioner's office?" he said. "Deputy Commissioner," Evelyn said. "It says interference with a pending territorial investigation." "It does." He looked at her with the expression of a young man recalibrating what kind of town he was living in. Then he sent the wire, took her money, and said, "I hope it works, ma'am," with the genuine feeling of someone who had just decided to have an opinion about something. The response came the next morning, not from Hartwell directly, from a territorial marshal's office in Cheyenne, addressed to the county sheriff of Harlan Creek, with a copy routed to the telegraph office and one sent to the land commissioner. Evelyn read the copy with Willis leaning over her shoulder and trying to pretend he wasn't. It was a formal notice directing the county sheriff to preserve all land assessment records pending investigation, prohibiting any collection actions or lien enforcements on properties under assessment dispute, and notifying the county that a territorial investigator would arrive within 10 days. 10 days. Not a month. She walked out of the telegraph office into the March morning light and stood on the boardwalk for a moment. The street was doing its usual business. A wagon passed. Two women came out of the dry goods store. Nobody paid her any particular attention, which was its own kind of change. 3 weeks ago, people had been paying her very particular attention. She thought, 10 days. Then she went to find Gideon. Chud. The county sheriff was a man named Aldous Pruitt, who was 60 years old and had been in his position long enough to have watched 3 different versions of this valley and had his own thoughts about what Aldrich Continental was doing to it. He had also, Evelyn had gathered from various sources, a brother-in-law who'd lost his property to a manufactured assessment 18 months ago and hadn't been able to prove it. Pruitt received the territorial marshal's notice with the expression of a man who has been handed both permission and a weapon simultaneously. He came to the Hale Ranch that afternoon with his deputy, a copy of the notice, and a question. "You've got the documentation for the other families?" 11 families, Gideon said. Documents going back 2 years. Pruitt looked at Evelyn. "You organized these?" "With help," she said. She thought of Hazel's careful notes, Marcia's meticulous records, Calloway's 30 years of stubbornness. Significant help. "The county land commissioner's name is on some of these fraudulent filings," Pruitt said. It wasn't a question. "Forrest Wade," Evelyn said. "His authorization signature appears on every document containing the fabricated ordinance number. 14 documents across 6 ranches." Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Forrest Wade had been county land commissioner for 9 years. He attended the church social. His wife organized the harvest fundraiser. He was not the kind of man anyone had thought to look at. "I'll need the originals," Pruitt said. "Everything, locked in my office until the investigator arrives." "I have copies," Evelyn said. "Everything is in duplicate. You can have the originals." He nodded. Then he looked at Gideon with something in his face that was older than the situation, something that had been there a long time. "I'm sorry it took this long," he said. "For what that's worth." "Take the documents," Gideon said. "We'll call it even." The 10 days were the hardest. Not because things got dramatically worse. Pruitt's office had frozen the official machinery, which meant the immediate collection threats had stalled, but because waiting, when you have been in motion for weeks, has its own particular weight. The ranch continued its daily requirements without regard for any of it. Animals needed feeding, fences needed checking. Noah had another cold that kept him home from school for 3 days and required the mustard poultice again and another round of poetry reading. On the 6th day, Virgil Crane came to the ranch one more time. He came alone, without the buggy, on horseback, and he came in the early morning when the light was still gray. Evelyn heard the horse and looked out the kitchen window and recognized him by the good coat. She went out to the porch. "Mr. Crane," she said, "Mr. Hale is in the barn. I came to talk to you," he said. He stayed on the horse, which was a choice. Staying mounted was a way of keeping distance, of being positioned to leave quickly. "I want you to understand something." She waited. "This doesn't have to end badly for your family," he said. "There are outcomes here where the ranch changes hands at a fair price and everyone walks away whole. The alternative—" Claude's response was interrupted. "The alternative," Crane said from his horse, in the gray morning light, "is that this gets considerably messier for everyone involved." Evelyn stood on the porch with her arms at her sides and looked at him. She had slept badly for 2 nights, and her patience had thinned to something close to transparent, and she was aware that this was probably the last time Virgil Crane would come to this ranch, one way or another. "Mr. Crane," she said, "the territorial investigator arrives in 4 days. 14 documents bearing forged ordnance citations are currently in Sheriff Pruitt's safe. 11 families have submitted sworn statements. The Deputy Commissioner's office in Cheyenne has received 3 separate communications from this valley in the last 10 days. She kept her voice even. "You came here this morning to offer me a way out. I'm telling you, with complete sincerity, that you should spend the rest of your morning thinking about your own." He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his face, the practiced pleasantness finally dropping away, and underneath it something older and tireder and less certain than anything he'd shown before. He turned his horse and rode down the lane without another word. She stood on the porch until he was gone. Then she went inside and put the kettle on because her hands needed something to do. Gideon came in from the barn an hour later and found her at the table with her notebook, going through the cross-reference list one more time. "Crane came," she said. "I saw the tracks." He poured himself coffee and sat down. "What did he want?" "To offer us a way out." "What did you tell him?" "To think about his own." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good," and drank his coffee, and that was the whole of it. Toit. The territorial investigator arrived on a Thursday, not with ceremony, but with a satchel and a two-man escort, and the unhurried efficiency of a man who has been doing difficult work for a long time and no longer needs to announce it. His name was Soren Aldgate, and he was somewhere between 45 and 60, with a thin face and pale eyes that moved over paperwork the way certain people's eyes move over landscapes, looking for what was wrong, where the terrain didn't match what it was supposed to be. He spent the first day at Prewitt's office, the second at the County Land Commissioner's building, and the third riding from ranch to ranch across the valley with a young clerk who wrote everything down. He came to the Hale property on the fourth day. Evelyn gave him the duplicate set of documents. Every family's records, organized chronologically and cross-referenced by the fabricated ordinance number. The second notebook, where she'd written the comparison between the ordinance citations and the actual territorial code. Hazel's notes, which she'd included without apology and which Aldgate read with more attention than she expected. He looked up from Hazel's pages. "Who wrote these?" "My daughter," Evelyn said. She said it the same way she'd said it to Marsh, without hesitation, because it had stopped requiring hesitation. "She's 10. Aldgate looked at the pages again. She noted dates and named sources. "This is organized." "She has her mother's instincts," Gideon said from the doorway. He was looking at Hazel when he said it, who was pretending to sweep the porch and was very obviously listening. And then some. Hazel swept faster, which was how she handled things that moved her when she didn't want them to show. Aldgate stayed for 2 hours. He asked specific questions and wrote down specific answers and didn't editorialize. When he left, he shook both their hands and said, "You'll receive official communication within 30 days, which was not dramatic and not warm and was exactly what the situation required. Evelyn watched his wagon go down the road and felt, for the first time in weeks, the particular feeling of having done everything that could be done. Not victory. She was careful about that word, had learned from watching her father that victory was rarely what you expected it to be when it finally came, but completion. The sense of a thing fully attempted. The 30 days were 30 days. Gideon patched the south fence. Evelyn started Hazel on fractions and discovered the girl had been doing rough fraction math for 2 years already, intuitively, because dividing provisions required it. Noah lost his winter cold finally and grew approximately half an inch in a single month in the way that 5-year-olds periodically do, as if the body has been waiting for the right moment. The kitchen acquired 2 more jars of herbs and a second good pot that Evelyn found at the dry goods store. The ranch hand got paid. The feed order went through. The account was unfrozen within 2 weeks of Aldgate's visit, which was the first concrete sign that the machinery had shifted. Life did not wait for official communication. The official communication came on a Wednesday, which had quietly become, in the Hale household, the day things happened. It was a substantial document, dense with the careful language of territorial government, but what it said was essentially this. A formal investigation had been opened into Aldrich Continental's land acquisition practices across the Harlan Creek Valley. County Land Commissioner Forrest Wade had been suspended pending criminal review. 2 members of the County Assessment Board had resigned, and a preliminary determination had been made that 14 assessment documents containing the fabricated ordinance citation 7-14C were legally void and unenforceable. Void and unenforceable. She read those words 3 times. All collection actions based on those documents were stayed. All liens placed under their authority were released. The bank in Casper issued a formal letter of correction within the week. 6 weeks after that, Virgil Crane was arrested in a hotel in Laramie on charges of fraud and conspiracy, along with 2 men from Aldrich Continental's corporate office, who had, apparently, not been as careful as they'd believed about the paper trail they'd left. The railroad company's land acquisition division was shut down pending a full audit. 3 other counties in the territory began their own reviews. Prewitt came to the ranch to tell them about Crane personally. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and said, Forrest Wade has a lawyer who's trying to make it about individual error. They'll have some trouble with that, given 14 documents. Given the notebook, Evelyn said. Given the notebook, Pruitt agreed. He looked at Gideon. The families that sold, the ones who did it under pressure from the fraudulent assessments. The territorial attorney is looking at forced sale remedies. It won't be perfect. These things never are. He paused. But some of them may get their land back. Gideon said nothing for a moment. He was thinking about the family Evelyn had noted in her second notebook, the one that had already sold, who hadn't come to their door. She'd found out later their name was Vickers, and they had 3 children, and they'd moved to a rented property 15 miles north after the sale. The Vickers family, he said. Pruitt looked at him. They're on the list. The valley changed in the way things change when a pressure that has been present for so long it stopped registering is finally removed. It didn't announce itself. It happened in the individual decisions that people made when the weight lifted. Callaway adding a second hand for spring planting, the Galloways starting work on the barn expansion they'd delayed for 2 years, Old Marsh riding to town for the first time in months without the set expression of a man braced for bad news. The women who had cut Evelyn on the street in February were not warm to her, and she didn't expect them to be. A handful of them had husbands whose interests had been aligned with the Aldriches, and the adjustment required was not the kind that happened quickly or gracefully. Margaret Aldrich left Harlan Creek entirely, relocating to a sister's property in Colorado, which simplified several social situations considerably. What changed in town was subtler than Evelyn had imagined it would be. It wasn't that people suddenly became friendly. It was that they stopped performing hostility, and in that space, normal transactions became possible. The dry goods owner asked her opinion on which primer to order for the school's library. A rancher's wife nodded to her at the post office. Not warmly, but cleanly, without the loaded quality that acknowledgement had carried before. Small adjustments. The social terrain shifting by degrees. She didn't need their approval. She had stopped needing it sometime around the night she'd sat at Gideon's kitchen table until 11, with documents spread between them, both of them working toward the same thing. There was a freedom in that, in having already chosen, already committed, already stayed through the part where it cost something. It made the town's adjustments interesting rather than necessary. Beggs, the schoolmaster, went out of his way to tell her that Hazel had received the highest marks in the valley on a territorial academic assessment. He said it with the air of a man offering partial reparation, which she accepted in the spirit it was given. She told Hazel that evening. The girl looked up from her primer with the expression of someone who has been told something they already suspected but hadn't let themselves assume. Highest in the valley? She said. That's what he said. Hazel looked down at her book. Her jaw moved the way it did when she was processing something. In arithmetic, too? He didn't specify, but I'd assume yes. A pause. Then quietly, Mama would have liked that. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. It was the 3rd or 4th time Hazel had said something like that, offered Clara into the room, casually, the way you mention someone who is gone but not absent. It had taken months to get there. Evelyn had not pushed it. She had waited, and it had arrived in its own time, and she had learned to receive it without making too much of it, because making too much of it would have made it harder, would have built weight around something that needed to be light. Yes, she said. She would have. Spring arrived in the valley the way Wyoming spring arrived. Not gently, not all at once, but in argument with the winter, warm days followed by hard frost, mud and then sun, and then mud again. The ranch responded to it the way land does when it's been maintained through a hard year by people who intended to stay. Slowly, then with some urgency, the way a patient who has been unwell begins to recover once the immediate crisis passes. The east pasture, which had been the subject of the fraudulent assessments for 2 years, was planted with the first section of spring grass crop in late April. Gideon did it himself, with Evelyn driving the second row, and Noah walking alongside in his muddy boots, with the focused concentration of a child performing a very important job that had not been assigned to him, but that he had decided was his regardless. Hazel watched from the fence, arms crossed on the top rail, chin resting on her arms. You look like your father when you stand like that, Evelyn said, coming over. Hazel considered this. Is that good? It means you're someone who watches carefully before you decide, Evelyn said. Yes, That's good. The girl was quiet for a moment. Below them, in the field, Gideon said something to Noah that Evelyn couldn't hear, and Noah laughed, a full, clear sound that carried across the field in the morning air. I keep thinking about the letter, Hazel said. Not as a confession, as something she'd been carrying and was setting down for a minute. About what would have happened if you'd just gone home. What makes you think about it? Because everything is different now. And it all started from something I did that was wrong. She frowned at the field. That doesn't seem like it should be how things work. Evelyn leaned on the fence beside her. No, she said. It doesn't seem like it should be. But it is. It is. She thought about how to say the next part without it sounding like a lesson, because Hazel had an accurate radar for when she was being taught at rather than talked to. Sometimes the wrong thing carries the right thing inside it, not because doing wrong is good. It isn't. You knew that when you wrote the letters, which is why you didn't tell your father. She paused. But you did it anyway because you were running out of time and out of options, and you were 9 years old and you loved your family, and that love went somewhere real. Hazel was quiet for a long time. The field moved in the light wind. I still feel bad about it, she said. That means you have good judgment, Evelyn said. You're allowed to feel bad about it, and also be glad it happened. Both are true. Hazel looked at her sideways. You do that a lot. Say two things are true at the same time. Because they usually are, Evelyn said. Most people would rather have one clear answer. Life is mostly uncooperative about that. The girl snorted, a brief, unpretty sound that was purely Hazel, entirely unperformed, and it made Evelyn want to laugh, which she did, and then Hazel did too, quietly, and they stood at the fence in the April morning watching Gideon and Noah work the field, and it was not a perfect moment. Hazel's boots were muddy, and her braid was coming undone. Evelyn's back ached from the previous day's fence checking. Down in the field, Gideon and Noah were having what appeared to be a disagreement about the correct direction to walk the row, which Noah was losing on the merits but refusing to concede. None of it was what she had imagined back in Ohio when she'd read that letter 3 times and tried to picture what a life like this would look like. It was better than she'd imagined, not easier, never easier, but fuller. More weight to it, more substance, more of the daily texture of people who had chosen each other and kept choosing, not because it was simple, but because it was real. A year to the week from the day she'd stepped off the train at Harlan Creek, Evelyn sat on the porch in the early evening with the good light coming across the valley and the mountains doing what they did at that hour, going amber and then rose and then a deep cold purple that had no name she'd ever found sufficient. Gideon came out and sat beside her. He had come to sit beside her in the evenings, the way he had come to set down her coffee in the mornings, without announcing it, without making it into a thing, just appearing and staying. Marsh stopped by today, he said. I know. I saw his horse. His daughter's coming back, the one who went to Denver after the sale. He thinks they might be able to work something out with the Vickers property, let them lease it back while the territorial remedy works through. He paused. He said to tell you the ordinance notebook is going to be cited in the formal complaint filing. The lawyer in Cheyenne wants to reference it. She thought about that. The notebook she'd bought for 12 cents at the dry goods store, sitting in Prewitt's safe, and then in an attorney's office in Cheyenne, working its way through the machinery of territorial law. 12 cents, she said. Gideon looked at her. The notebook. It cost 12 cents. He considered this for a moment. Good value, he said. She laughed. It was a genuine sound, unguarded, and she heard him make a small sound beside her that was the closest thing to easy laughter she'd heard from him. And she thought, there it is. The thing that's been underneath all of it, patient, waiting. Inside the house, she could hear Noah refusing to go to bed on the grounds that he hadn't finished his drawing, which was a negotiation that Hazel had apparently agreed to supervise while Evelyn was on the porch, and Hazel's voice was doing the particular patient but firm thing she'd been doing since before she was old enough to have been required to do it. She was 11 now, and the quality of her patience had changed. It was less the exhausted stoicism of a child managing too much and more, the considered steadiness of someone who had learned that she didn't have to do everything alone and had begun, slowly, to believe it. That was the change Evelyn held on to. Not the investigation, not the documents, not the arrest of Virgil Crane in a Laramie hotel. Those mattered, but the change in how Hazel held herself, and that was the one that had cost the most to get to and meant the most. She asked me something last week, Gideon said, into the evening quiet. Hazel? She asked me if she could call you Mama. Evelyn was still for a moment. What did you tell her? I told her that was between her and you. He was looking at the mountains. I told her Clara was her mother and would always be. And I told her that having someone else to call by that name didn't take anything away from that. It just meant she had more. He paused. She seemed to think about it for a while. She hasn't asked me yet. She will, he said. In her own time. She does things when she's decided, not before. Evelyn thought about that. About the 6 drafts. About the girl at the platform in the too-thin coat, shaking, having run out of every option except the most direct one. About the way she'd stood at the fence in April and said, I still feel bad about it, with the clear-eyed honesty of someone who didn't want comfort more than she wanted truth. She thought about what she would say when the question came. Yes. Of course, yes. Without reservation and without the qualifier that it was complicated or that she hadn't expected it or that it had grown on her gradually, all of which were true, and none of which mattered in the face of the simple fact that she loved this child. Had probably loved her, in the seed of it, since the moment a small hand grabbed the hem of her coat on a frozen platform and a voice said, Please don't go. The mountains went their slow way through the colors of evening. Inside, Noah's bedtime negotiation reached some kind of settlement, and the house went quiet with the particular quality of quiet that meant children were finally still. Gideon's hand found hers on the armrest of the chair. Not demonstrative, just there, his rough fingers resting against hers, the simple pressure of it. She thought, not for the first time, about the letter. About the 9-year-old who had sat alone somewhere in this house, with her father's old correspondence and a pen and a piece of paper, and decided to try. Who had written 6 drafts, who had practiced the handwriting, who had found the address and paid for the postage out of whatever small amount she'd saved and sent it, and then waited. What a thing, to love someone that hard at 9 years old. What a thing to be so frightened of losing what was left that you did the only brave and wrong and desperate thing you could think of. What a thing for that act to have traveled 3 days by train and arrived on a frozen platform and unraveled itself, improbably, into this. There was a lesson in it, though Evelyn distrusted lessons that arrived too neatly. Life wasn't a lesson. It was a series of choices made by imperfect people under pressure, most of them irreversible, many of them wrong in their method and right in their result, or right in their method and wrong in their result. And sometimes, rarely, unreliably, with no guarantee, they lined up the right way. A frightened child's forged letter. A woman with a packed trunk and nowhere better to be. A man who had buried his grief so deep he'd mistaken the hole it left for strength. A fabricated ordinance number and a 12-cent notebook and a lawyer in Cheyenne and a telegraph operator named Willis who had said, I hope it works with genuine feeling. All of it together, none of it planned. That was the truth of how families were made and how communities were held together and how the things worth keeping got kept. Not by the grand gestures, not by the clean victories, but by the accumulation of ordinary choices made by people who kept choosing, day by day, to stay. The last light left the mountains and the stars came out over Wyoming, sharp and plentiful, the way they were out here where there was nothing between them and you. Inside the house, the children were quiet. The ranch was still. Gideon said nothing. Evelyn said nothing. They sat in the kind of silence that only exists between people who have already said the hard things and chosen each other on the far side of them. It was enough. It was, without question, enough.